Hi, my name is Bruce Boldrin. I'm founder of the Enterprise Engagement Alliance and publisher of Rewards Recognition Network. And we're dedicated to sharing information on the effective program design and process, implementation, and impact measurement. And to that end, we publish regular articles, how-to articles on effective practices based on input from people who've been doing it for years. And I want you to know for every show, we reach out to top experts, not based on whether they do business with us, but based on their years of experience. That's what we look for. And by the way, we always look for diversity in women and all ethnicities. And our selections are always based on the quality people that are available at this meeting. So if you see, I'm sorry for men, it's not because that's our policy. So anyway, we're very lucky today to talk about the latest practices in channel engagement and marketing, the whole process of selling through distribution partners. And we have with us three people who fit the quality of having a lot of experience in this. And starting with Rob Legge, he's Director of Consumer and Channel Marketing at EGR International, which is a full service engagement agency based near Wall Street. Paul Donahue, president of Paul Charles Associates, they are a leading advisory firm for sales and channel engagement management across the enterprise, and they have leading clients around the world to whom, for whom they provide support. And then we have Rick Garlick. He's an adjunct professor at Penn State University, but he's also, and he just has a new position here, so I have to check that out. He is also a consulting partner to BVA of BDRC, which is now a division of Ipsos, which again is one of the world's leading polling and survey and analytics companies. So finally, just a little housekeeping. The Enterprise Engagement Alliance is your how-to organization for people engagement across the enterprise. We focus on the latest news, research, effective practices. We give a ton of stuff away. You go to theeea.org and you'll find a bunch of stuff, including our media properties. We are here to make business better for everyone. So I am now going to stop this share. And I'm going to start first with you, Paul. Basically, I know the companies you deal with, and we don't get into that publicly, but you deal with a lot of companies that sell through distribution partners. How has that changed over the years? To what extent are the factors needed to engage these people changing, given that they don't work for you if you sell through them? They work for themselves. What are the key factors you'd say at work today?
I think one of the most important things is to have the right person or the right people managing the channel relationships. We've seen a tendency, certainly in the manufacturing sector, where there's a predisposition to think that the channel is just out for themselves, that the channel won't really represent them enthusiastically. And it develops into a negative relationship. And we've worked with some organizations. There was one in particular where through strategic moves over the course of about 2 to 3 years, they significantly increased the effectiveness of their channel. And I think that they became true partners as opposed to quasi adversaries.
And so, Rob, you've been doing this for more years than you look. What kinds of changes have you seen in terms of that relationship? Again, manufacturers are often very frustrated dealing through channel partners. How has the landscape changed in terms of these relationships, especially with the factors of disintermediation that we're going to talk about with Rick?
Well, yeah, I think that's an astute observation by Rick and you about the changing landscape there and the move towards just direct relationships between consumers and manufacturers. So that's certainly a factor. And that's, I think, put pressure on some of those distributor relationships. So we've seen in certain areas, kind of entrenchment where you have some distributors who maybe are become more resistant to manufacturers offering some of these incentive programs. They want to have a lot more control over the content that their employees see and what sort of rewards are offered, just so they have more ability to, control the narrative, so to speak. So I think that's certainly come into play. Um,
Well, I
but
wanted to ask you about, so this is a really important point. What you're saying is that you're seeing a shift where the distribution partners are saying, hey, I want to have more say over this. You're
Mhm.
giving me these incentive programs, these training programs. No, wait a minute. Let's sit down. Let's be more collaborative about that. Is that what you're saying?
Not exactly. No.
Okay,
So
that's why I
in
asked.
in some instances, they're saying we want to be less collaborative, and all training. Actually, we want to be the ones administering that. So that should run through our platform. Any incentives should come through us. And I think when you get into situations where you have larger companies operating, together, you see this where, in some instances, one could be considered a supplier and the other the retailer in a sense, but in effect is a distributor relationship. You do see this where they're both major established players, and you they're both vying for being in control of um, everything that their sales force sees, and they don't want to be cut out of the loop, essentially.
That's
um
very interesting, Paul. We're going to get to that with you in a minute. Rick, you've before this meeting, you made a very interesting point that many industries now are going through different phases of disintermediation, right? Going direct, omni-channel. That has so many implications, but isn't one of the fundamental implications trust? Uh, in other words, how can a distribution partner really trust a brand if lurking in the back of their mind is disintermediation?
Well, that's
By the way,
certainly
what that
true.
folks
And
means, I just so that get out of jargon, that means being cut out of the distribution loop, folks, and having the manufacturer go direct. Go ahead, Rick.
let's just face it, we all know the impact of digital marketing, that the world knows more about you and me than it probably ought to. It's scary how much the marketing world knows about our personal habits and preferences. And now there's this ability to directly target you and me in a way that channel partners aren't able to do. And so I can now, as a manufacturer, come directly to you as a consumer and market to you through all sorts of channels that were never possible before. So now it's becoming a value proposition. Like, what does a channel partner bring to the party that creates value for both the consumer and the brand? And this is where I hope, in our discussion today, we can really talk about how do we create value as channel partners, and how, as consultants, do we help our channel partners create value for consumers that they're able to survive and profit and continue to create value for the companies they represent.
Well, Paul, that's a beautiful lead into you because it seems to me that's where it comes down to creating value at the end of the day. And the world has changed, right? And with the internet and the ability to buy on demand directly, value creation becomes more difficult. Do you think the traditional distribution model in capitalism is a threat because of digital marketing? Do you think that many industries will move to a direct model, or do you think the concept of selling through channels is essentially still sound?
Well, I certainly think that that concept is very much still sound. And I think it's important for us to differentiate marketing from selling. The digital marketing is a terrific tool. Will sales best practices have to change to adapt to today's technology? Sure. But back in the 1950s, and unfortunately, Bruce, both you and I remember them, there was a lot of smart people who thought that salespeople were going to become obsolete. And that's because of television. They thought, hey, we can run ads. But that didn't happen. And even 50 years later, many thought the internet would put salespeople out of business. Now, it might have put order takers out of business, but not real sales professionals. Every manufacturer we've worked with has recognized that without the boots on the ground that their distribution channel represents, they can't really develop the in-depth relationships with buyers that they need. and not only with buyers, but with other influencers within the organizations to whom they're selling. And of course, this problem becomes even exponentially more challenging if the organizations they're selling to are large. The bigger the organization, the more difficult it is to, I mean, it's hard to build a relationship just through marketing. So I really think you need both. And that's why I think the future of the distribution channel is definitely a good one. Yes, there'll have to be some modification. Hey, that's the world around us, right? Everything changes. We have a thing we call the woulda, coulda, shoulda club. The big names, household names, Kodak, Polaroid, and I won't go on, Blockbuster, that didn't change, tried to protect their model, and they failed. But if you can modify your approach and add value, as you guys are saying, but do it in the way that can't be done through technology, and that's the relationships, the door openers, and the boots on the ground local.
So, Rob, as we all know, the big challenge of selling through distribution partners is that they're their own business people. They don't work for you, and we all know that if you're a big brand, you're okay with your distribution partner, right? If you're such a big brand name like Kohler, let's say, um, people are going to ask for Kohler when they walk into that distribution. When they walk in with that distributor. So, what do you kind of in an overview? If you were sitting next to the CEO of a secondary brand, a brand that isn't as powerful as Kohler, and she all of a sudden started asking you a few questions about what you do, and you explained what you did. She said, "Okay, well, in a nutshell, how does a second name brand break out, with a distribution partner? What do we need to do?"
Well, that's a great question. Hopefully, I'm in that position pretty soon here. But I think going back to what Paul said, at the end of the day, it comes down to um, the strength of your relationships and your ability to build those relationships. Um, any promotion or any offer you can make, is just a tool to building that trust, building those relationships, and creating those bonds that your partners become unwilling to walk away from. Um, so, tactically, that could take many different forms. And if you're facing a larger, more established competitor, you're going to have to be creative to come up with ways that stand out. And in the absence of some concrete scenario, it's tough to say exactly what you should do because it's going to be very dependent on the the situation that you're selling in, what tools and resources your competitors are offering, and how maybe you can disrupt that and start to gain a foothold and make a name for yourself, stand out. We're in an era where attention is something that has been commoditized by players like Google and Facebook, and I think there is a bit of an arms race, just in how can we grab and keep everyone's attention, and everyone seems to be vying for the ability to do that. So, and I think to tie into another piece of our conversation, you need to be able to come to your distribution partners with an offer of real value. It can't be gimmicks. It can't be, just pie in the sky. You need to come to them and you need to say, look, I want to partner with you genuinely. Here is why. Here's how I'm going to help you grow your business. And if that offer is real and has teeth, any good businessman is going to sit down and listen.
Well, Rob, research supports what you're saying. A woman, and I always mention her because she died tragically young, a woman named Erin Anderson, and she was a professor at Wharton when I was a very young man. And then she went over to Paris. She got an amazing seat in Paris. And she did more research on channel engagement than I think anybody since. And since a lot of it was before the internet, in fact, I'm going to try to find a bunch of it. But Rob, what she basically said is what you said, that the way that it works with channel relationships. And what makes them critical is that you become a partner in helping them build their business. And she actually did a research project, an empirical research project based on actual behavior that found that offering a 3 to 4% price advantage to that distributor was not as motivational as strategies, Rob, to help them build their business. And to your point, there is no common script to that because every industry is different. But we're going to get to that because I want to get to specifics. There are ways, so that we can talk about. But Rick, one of the things I have found about people management, I'd like to get your view on this, is that it's often very ad hoc. People sit around a room and they throw around ideas. Oh, gee, what will those dealers like? Maybe they like, oh, our guys are offering them trips to the Caribbean this year. Maybe we should go to, Punta Cana or something, right? Or, gee, I heard this, I think we should do that, right? And Paul, this is going to be a question for you and Rob. And of course, I'm not going to ask you to ever, this is just your general observations. In the world of manufacturing, there's something called total quality management. It's a strategic and systematic approach. It's holistic. It looks at what all the customers need, what the internal customers need. It looks at all the stakeholders, how they affect it. There's metrics all along the way. Everybody has voice. It's everything's measured. Do you think that characterizes the average channel engagement strategy, that strategic, systematic, holistic approach with clear impact metrics?
Yeah, I'll tell you, Bruce, of course, I'm always a data guy. I always think people get themselves in trouble when they say something like, well, I've been in this industry long enough to know what people want. To me, those are the words that take people down a bad path. I think there are a lot of impact metrics that we can obviously look at. Obviously from a sales productivity standpoint, those are the easy ones, right? But we can certainly look at things like net promoter scores. If you've got a channel partner, would they choose to recommend you as an organization to which to affiliate? Would customers continue to recommend you as a brand, if you were the distributor? There's all sorts of data that we collect, and I think we've gotten away from that a little bit in recent years. After COVID, I think there was kind of a pullback of the kind of customer metrics that we were looking at prior to COVID. And some of the data I've looked at and taught at Penn State shows that customer engagement has not been as important. And I think we really need to get back to what differentiates the experience both for our channel partners and our customers, and to really speak to that and understand one size does not fit all in a situation like that.
Yeah, I think that's really critical. And that's something that obviously Rob brought up. Paul, so really in your experience, nobody gets, I haven't seen many training programs at universities on channeling marketing engagement. I'm sure there's some esoteric courses somewhere, but I don't think the average marketing or sales manager, has been trained in distribution management and by the way, there's a whole logistics field, right? There's intense training on that. Paul, am I wrong, or do you see a lot of science and systematic approach in channel management, or does it tend to be very kind of how the sales manager views it?
Yeah, I think you're really onto something there. And Rick, you talked about this not a one size fits all. I've seen a quote on that one size fits almost no one. And I think that's the reality. Um, we see at the organizational level, performance management tends to be very ad hoc. And the same thing with channel performance management. And just like the EEA has promoted for so long now, you need a formalized plan. Just as you need a formalized engagement plan, we need a formalized performance management plan. Yes, there has to be metrics, but there also has to be a method of planning and making sure that we execute those things that are so important with respect to the relationship management, but they're not urgent. How often do we interact with our channel members? One of the organizations, the one I referenced earlier, one of the first things we help them do is to set a more appropriate cadence for the interaction with each of their channel partners. We started doing a monthly newsletter so that the communication got to be, more emphatic. We created an online resource bank filled with marketing materials, sales best practices, We did monthly webinars called Tech Talks that the chief technology officer put on, getting into the technology of their components. And I'm thinking more in terms of the relationships with a channel that is in a B2B world as opposed to B2C. And I think maybe to the point you raised earlier, the B2C might that there might be more risk for those channel partners than for the B2B ones, because it's harder to develop relationships with consumers. But consumers do, in some cases, develop local brand loyalty. And I think that they have to, help. From the first day we met, and I looked through the EEA, all that curriculum as we got certified, one of the things that stood out to me is that the best way to manage your channel is to, as you've just said, help them run a better business. And I think that if we can do that, regardless of B2B, B2C, or whatever, I think that we can have relationships that are sustainable.
Well, you make a really good point, and it's a great transition for Rob because Rob handles both consumer and B2B. Rob, I think he makes a great point that the companies that are the distribution partners that are at greater risk are those in the B2C marketplace, right? Because if you're a big brand, you've got a lot of relationships. In fact, I tell our clients in the corporate market, major brands, all you have to do is put on your website a link to corporate incentives and gifting, and 10% of your customers are eventually going to find you for that. So Rob, but in the B2B area, I think there's plenty of opportunity, don't you? Because if anything in the B2B area, most manufacturers do not have the legs on the ground to reach channels. I mean, the end B2B customer, do they?
Well, again, I think it depends on who you're talking about, but I think going back to what Paul was saying, I I do really feel for the clients that we work with, in figuring out like your plan, like talking about uh, the your total approach, having a systematic way to engage your customers, implementing metrics that all tie in together and give you a holistic view of how does your marketing work with your co-op spend, and how is that impacting sales. For the clients that we work with, it's difficult for them to synthesize all that together. And I think that's where people like us come in because we, have that more holistic view of how all these puzzle pieces fit together. But for someone who's middle management or lower tier executive who is that's the level that a lot of us I think are working at to come up with these programs, they're forced into a more myopic view for performance. They're not given years to put this stuff together. They're given limited budgets, and they're tasked with, here's the budget you have within this scope of focus. Give me results. And frequently, I think professionals like us are brought into those situations, and so we have to balance between something that can be effective within a limited scope and trying to kind of train our clients as far as these best practices and saying, hey, here's what we can do within the focus that you have right now. But, there's a larger picture for us to view here. So how can we begin with this stepping stone and then build upon that into something that becomes a greater whole?
So what you're really saying then, in a sense, is that some of the channel engagement efforts or marketing efforts are stymied by, in some, you didn't say this, but I think it's the case, there might be silos, for instance, in the organization, because the solution to help that reseller build his or her business might include social media support, might include some sort of marketing support, might include training support,
Mm-hmm.
might include a motivational event. But if it's going to be strategic and systematic, that might cross into other parts of the organization. So,
Exactly. And, you might have someone who's in charge of a company's co-op marketing who really gets it. They buy into the philosophies of corporate engagement and connecting with their channel and building these relationships. but you also need to get the marketing guy within their organization on board. You need the C-suite to be on board with creating these programs. So there needs to be, I think also for us, the ability to clearly communicate this. And it's a chicken and egg situation. No business is going to want to put dollars behind something that they don't see some real reliable results, but you can't show them the results until they start tracking some of these metrics and making some of these interventions. So, I think the work, Bruce, that you're doing to sort of build the case for this is hugely important, because we need to be able to take this to our clients and say, look, this works. We can point to these other scenarios where it has worked in the past. Now, prior performance does not equal future results. We're going to have to judge your case by the situation that you are in, and you need to start measuring before you can start truly gaining insights and making, sea change. But you have to take that first step.
And so, folks, I think, again, this is important part of this discussion is really stopping and looking at the situation holistically, understanding what that relationship with that dealer is about. What are his or her needs as a business? What do they need to build their business? What do they need to avoid disintermediation? How can you help them do that? And that, to Rob's point, and I think everybody's point, depends on every single client, but that still requires a systematic approach to get there. Rick, in terms of case studies or success stories, I think there are some tremendously good in the travel industry, for instance. I think that is an industry that does a pretty, and I think for the rest of this, let's switch to the positive. Let's switch to what can work. And I think what we're learning from the work of, first off, of all of your observations and then the research of Aaron Anderson and others is, again, as Rob said, it's about that relationship. And it's not just say we're good boys, good old boys and girls playing golf and whatnot. No, how am I helping you build your business? So, for instance, in the tech business, or Rick, Microsoft, uh, let's say Amazon, AWS, Oracle, HubSpot, Salesforce, they all depend upon their distribution partners. And Rick, it seems to me that the noteworthy success factor, and I'm going to ask the next two of you as well, is that they help these guys in their business. And in other words, they literally create a mini economy around, like, there's a whole industry of implementers for technology. And these are independent business people, often small companies, some of them big, that are, that implement Salesforce. So let's look at the characteristics of those companies. What are they doing that is different?
Well, you were talking about case studies and, talking about success stories. So let's look at this. So when I think about, you and I were talking about auto dealerships, and I was telling you, I read a study that showed that 50% of car buyers said in one study that they would rather buy direct from a manufacturer than a dealer, even if they didn't save any money. And I told you that I would rather buy directly from a particular dealer. Uh, I'd rather pay the markup because of several factors. And one of those is an integrity factor. And I think, what can companies do to help their channel partners? What can channel partners do to help the relationship with their customers? There's a key element, and one of those is integrity. So always having integrity, always following through with your promises, establishing something you talked about at the onset of trust. So knowing that if there's a problem, someone will stand behind the issue, rectify in a manner that will either meet or exceed expectations, so that I never have to worry about being left out in the wind, so to speak. So having that integrity piece is a key component for both the channel partner's relationship with the brand for whom they work and for the company's relationship with the channel partner. And that's just one element, but I think that that's a critical success element. One of the things that I do, and probably my colleagues do with the people we consult with, is trying to understand what differentiates success versus non-success? What makes the best of what they do versus the rest? And if you can find success and replicate it, understand what is it that elevates a successful channel partner from others or a successful relationship, and then replicate that and share those best practices. That's what we can do for our channel partners, and that's what our channel partners can do for their customers.
In other words, to really understand what that customer experience, the desirable customer experience is, which obviously always starts with integrity, and then scale it in a sense, dissect it and scale it and support it.
Mhm.
Paul, your thoughts on this? How, what makes a successful distribution partner relationship? What makes that Microsoft model, Salesforce model work so well?
Well, at one point or another, each of you has talked about, Rick, you talked about impact measurement. Rob, you talked about measurement, and you've always been a proponent, Bruce, of measurement. And I think it's helping the channel partners know what to measure. If we only measure the outcomes, that's hard to make somebody better. There has to be some measurement of activity as well. So sharing best practices. This is what we've seen in the marketplace. If you do these things, your marketing will be more effective, your sales will be more effective, your customer relationships will be more productive, and help them to measure those activities. And as you know, maybe you've read I suspect you have, the four disciplines of execution. And they talk about, you've got to understand both the lead and the lag measures. So it's those lead measures, the activities that you can course correct if you're not, year to date where you want to be, month to date where you want to be. But a lot of people don't pay attention to the activities. And, you've brought up Salesforce a number of times. If you think about the world of selling, as CRM systems and things like Salesforce have become the norm, people that are involved in day-to-day selling have lost track of one of the simplest metrics. I've been asking sales professionals for 10 years this one question, and most of them, I'm going to say 80%, honestly can't answer it. And the question is this: I know every day is different, but on average, how many sales calls do you make per day? Oh, they hate that question. And some of them say, well, we focus on quality, not quantity. So I said, okay, so if you came into work each day and made one call, would you be successful? And they say, well, no. I said, well, then quantity matters. But nobody's keeping the daily log sheet, so to speak. Well, some people are, but most are not. And that's the kind of metric that if we're focused on, well, how often are we in touch with the customers? How often are we seeing them versus just sending them emails? How often are we conducting events? How often are we doing this, that, or the other thing? I think that is the way that you help people to become, as Rick said, the best as opposed to the mid-level.
Well, again, all of the research on measurement, always in the world of total quality management, you put together your outcome metrics with your input metrics.
Yeah.
What did you do to create that output and then correlate them? So, Rob, in your many, many years of business experience, tell me whether this is what you've seen. What I have witnessed, and remember, as a reporter, I see things from a different standpoint than a salesperson, right? Because as a reporter, I'm often talking off the record with the people that are doing the work, right? And they'll tell me, please don't publish this or I'm going to lose my job. And what I generally have found with channel engagement, tell me if I'm wrong, and there's always exceptions, like Trek Bicycles would be a great exception. But oftentimes, that's a company that really has a holistic strategy that, really understands the entire distribution process and what drives bicycle sales and how they can support those retailers. But my experience, Rob, is that a lot of these companies just kind of, I think you said it before, the person has a budget. They're given a budget. They don't have a lot of time. And there's a real tendency to do what I did last year. There's a real tendency to just get it done. And then the other element is there's the only metric is sales, really. So if sales go up, they're off the hook. Okay. Now there are exceptions to that, but that's been my experience. That a lot of this stuff is a lot more slapdash than one would expect in major corporations. Am I being unfair?
No, I don't think you are. I think that's absolutely true, and it's something that both internally at companies and I think organizations like us are always going to be fighting against that tendency. Uh, it's easy to fall into the trap of just doing what I did last year, and hey, this has always worked. So, why should I change what's not broken? Um, and to be clear, I'm not saying that anyone should change something that is actually working. But to Paul's point, you need to be measuring the right things, and making sure you've got your inputs and your outputs logged, so that you can actually see, hey, is it actually working, and is the lever that I'm pulling over here actually what's causing the result on the other side? And frequently I think it's very fuzzy, to say what actually is the cause. It could just be a great year. The fact that ice cream cone sales go up in the summer might not have been because of the coupon you were offering, you know?
Well, and that's I think the whole thing, Rick, about measurement people. I think there's a general tendency to believe that things can't be measured. That if it's manufacturing, we can measure widgets and productivity, how many came out, how many were defective, blah, 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 how many customer service calls we got, what was the cycle time. But when it comes to people things, am I wrong? But is there a general kind of skepticism that, well, gee, what really caused that? So at the end of the day, we don't really need to bother to measure it.
Well, when I was at Gallup, we used to have a saying, and it was not my saying, it's the company saying, that what gets measured is what matters. And basically, like whatever you're measuring, that's what matters to the employee. So if you're being measured on certain productivity measures, that's what you're going to be driving toward. Um, Everything, as a research scientist, I can tell you, everything is measurable. Some might challenge me on that, but I can tell you that my business as a researcher and as a social scientist, everything can be quantified and measured. Um, Sometimes it's trickier, but you can always measure it. The problem is, and the companies that I work with, particularly like when you're measuring the impact of incentive programs, a lot of times when you ask companies, are you measuring the impact of your incentive programs? They'll say, well, we don't know how to do it. Now, the fact you don't know how to do it doesn't mean that it can't be done. And that's why, you've got companies, and not just what I do or what my colleagues in the panel do, but you've got companies like the ROI Institute and organizations like that. Their specialty is figuring these things out. So don't ever let anybody tell you that they can't measure it. They may not know how to measure it, but everything can be measured.
Well, and by the way, Jack and Patty Phillips of the ROI Institute are going to be joining us on August 22nd,
There you
26th
go.
to talk about that. So, Paul, um, how rigorous in general, and we're going to end with some specifics. How it to me, a channel engagement program, ideally, you sit down at every beginning of the year, you get input from your key channel partners, you get input and you involve your key salespeople and even your service people to get the really good sense of what the needs are. You sit down with the distribution partners, as Robert implies, and find out what are their needs. And then you develop a holistic approach that, where you give the different tools. Do they need marketing support? Do they need training support? Do they need vacation support? Would they like it if you'd fund vacations for your top performing salespeople? Well, that could be a factor. And then you come up with metrics, impact metrics, and it's not just sales per distributor, right? It's the activities that you did to support those sales, and you correlate the two, right? How many companies on average really take a rigorous, because that's what you do in TQM, total quality management. You do an involvement process, an assessment process. You involve all your stakeholders. You develop a strategic and systematic approach that addresses all the levers of engagement. And then you measure all along the way and you correlate activities with impact. And then you continuously improve. That's TQM. Is that characterized channeling marketing strategy management, do you think, generally in this country?
Well, I think it should. And that TQM, you brought this up several times today. It is all about measurement and it is all about setting the right goals. Giving people a better mindset as to what could potentially be. We worked with a company, as you might remember, that was a pioneer in TQM here in the United States. Um, and one of the exercises we used to do in the training that we did is we would put the group into small groups of 5, and we would tell them we were going to measure their ability to work as a team. And the mission was we gave them all an envelope. They couldn't open it until we said go, and each envelope had a puzzle. And we said, when we say go, we're going to measure how long it takes you to do the puzzle. So they had no idea what the puzzle looked like. We say go, and they all go, and they all get it put together in about 2 minutes to 2.5 minutes. We have them put the pieces back, and then we ask, now that you know what it looks like, can you do it faster? Enthusiastic, yes. They all do it in about a minute. Then we say, now, if we gave you 5 minutes to plan, do you think you could do it faster still? And we get reluctant, yes. We say, okay, we'll give you 10 minutes to plan, but we want to let you know that we've been doing this for many years. The record is 6 seconds. They look and say, what? It just took us a minute. They all do it in less than 20 seconds once they realize it can be done. So I think it's given the channel partner the hope, the belief that, gee, if I work at this, if I pay attention to these metrics, I can improve. Yeah, the world's not going, to heck in a handbasket because of the digital movement. It's just I have to learn how to work with it. And I think if we can help people that way, we bring value.
Well, Robert, that leads me to an idea, and I wonder how many companies actually do this, is to take your 20% of your top distributors, because we all know that 20% of them probably produce 80% of your business, right? And you individually sit down with each one of them at the beginning or 3 months before the beginning of the next year or season. And you literally go over what are your organization's objectives? What are you trying to accomplish? What can my brand do to help you support that? Do you think is that where you think the market really needs to be going? Almost obviously you can't do that with the distributor who's only doing 0.5% of your business, right? But you can learn a lot from the 20% who are doing 80% of it to help the other 80%. Do you think a more personalized, customized approach might make sense? Or does it
Well,
make?
just, look, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but engaging in those important relationships is that is the foundation on which all the rest of this is built. So, to Rick and Paul's point, we've got to measure this stuff. But if no one's filling out the measurement spreadsheets, you've got nothing. You have to get buy-in from your distributors. You have to get, the salespeople to log those sales calls. And this is where kind of our experience in the industry comes in is, you've got to sometimes give salespeople an incentive to log that sales call. They have to have a reason to do that. If they're just viewing that as a chore that has no higher purpose and no connection to anything else, it's just busy work. And they're not going to do it. And then you have no data and you're dead in the water. So, it all plays back to, having those trusted relationships and having that buy-in and that belief that this is not something that we're just doing to check a box. We're doing it because it's important and it drives results.
I think that's another great point, Rob. Thanks. Purpose. People are, we're a little bit more, complex than robots, right? Or hamsters in a cage. And for instance, look, I'm in sales. I've been in sales all my life. Nobody wants to be told they have to make 100 calls a day, right? No, but if it's in the context of a story and a purpose, and it's fun, and it becomes a contest, then, Rick, what doesn't this whole concept of purpose apply to channel engagement relationships as well? This isn't just about the dollars and cents. This is about building a better business together.
Oh, it absolutely does. I think everything goes back. Bruce, I've done a lot of work in the whole idea of pride in what you
Yeah.
do. And, there has to be some motivation. I think you have to believe in the product you're selling and you have to really buy into a bigger sense of mission. So you can't just be doing it for the money. But I don't care what you're selling, you have to, if you're going to be good at it, you really have to believe in what you're doing, whether you're selling cars or selling pharmaceutical products or manufacturing goods. You have to really believe in the company that you're working for and see a bigger mission and have pride in what you do.
And Paul, I think this a lot applies to your practice because I know you're very much involved with sales training. And training is a major problem for channel partners, right? They have turnover and retaining their employees. They obviously have their own inventory management issues, their cash flow issues. They've got issues today related to the uncertainty of tariffs. They might have technology issues. So isn't our job in building relationships really understanding the issues faced by each one of our channel partners? I don't think there is a one size fits all approach to channel engagement. It seems to me to be incredibly personalized to each partner, isn't it?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think Rick's comments earlier about the one size fits all align with yours. And in a few instances that we've been involved with, and certainly the one I referenced earlier, uh, we used to do quarterly roundtables with the channel partners. And we would do two of them each quarter, to accommodate different time zones. And we would get input from the network, from the channel. And then the content in the portal and in the material that we shared with them over the next 3 months was based on what was happening on the street then, because it would change over the course of the year. And I think you're right. You do have to get input from them so you know how to help them. And then it becomes more individualized. We saw variations based on region, based on various, a lot of these people were selling to companies that sold to the Department of Defense and to aerospace. Big changes there would change the necessary approach. So I think that everything is somewhat, I love the idea of the belief in the mission that Rick talked about. We get people to think about it from that bigger perspective. I think in your methodology for just workforce engagement, that you talk about aligning people's jobs with the organizational goals to help people get a better sense of the importance of their work. I think it's the same thing is true with managing the channel relationships.
So, guys, getting toward the end here, so what do you think if you could say, Rob, that, and I did not give you this question in advance, but forgive me if it's a tough one. But what do you think is one of the biggest mistakes you have seen in general? What is the number one or two mistakes that companies make in their channeling or marketing strategies, do you think?
Well, I've seen a lot of mistakes, so it's tough to just pick one because there's
Well,
a
give
lot
us
of
a
ways to
few.
go wrong. Um, I think the biggest one is kind of just the ready, fire, aim. So I think it's important, and again, I keep coming back to the
Please do.
same soundbite, but if you don't connect and gather that input first, I think that's a really critical step and a really important point. And understanding the situation that your constituents are in. If you just run something that is promoting something that isn't going to serve the purposes of their business, that can have the absolute opposite effect of what is intended. So if I run a promotion, let's say, we're talking car dealerships and, I'm trying to get you to offer service contracts, but, maybe I, for some reason, don't, that's the lowest margin area of my business. And I don't want to offer more service contracts. Um, you know, that, that you're now at odds with your constituent group just because you didn't ask, and it seems so straightforward, but it's a hard thing to do because, to your point, depending on how big you are, that can be a difficult thing to do. And of course, you're always going to get conflicting viewpoints from your distributor network. So you're going to have to balance the feedback that you get. But it's a critical step. And, before you take that first leap forward and you actually put something out in the world, you need to have a relatively high degree of confidence that it's going to land and that you're doing it with the best interests of your distribution network in mind. I think that also is something that's going to continue to build trust, continue to build those relationships if you're genuinely operating with, how can I help my partners succeed and have a tide that's raising all ships? um, that philosophy, I think, is always going to yield results.
By the way, I got to tell you, Erin Anderson must be looking down from heaven now. Another finding from her research was that dealers don't want to hear how you're going to help them take market share from somebody else. That doesn't help them at the end of the day. If they're selling less toothpaste from this person and more from the other, what difference does it make? They want to help build their category. How can you help me sell more of this type of widget? That gets them. So anyway, but I love your, because that's, I would agree, number one problem, ready, aim, people really take a very ad hoc approach. Rick, what would you say are some of the biggest mistakes companies make?
Well, I tell you, one thing I would say is that from all of the work I've done with many industries, I think we can all agree selling has never been harder. And one of the things that I think that the biggest mistake that companies do is they perhaps assume that it's not gotten harder, that it's no harder today than it was before, and that if I put you out there, selling's your job, and if you just work harder at it, you'll be successful. And that if you're not selling, it's not because you're not working hard enough or you're not doing the right things. Salespeople, I think today have never needed more support. They've never needed more communication and best practices. And I think if we're not taking enough time with our channel partners, that's a huge mistake. We're not recognizing how difficult the landscape has gotten out there, even in terms of people's willingness to spend time with you. I hear from pharmaceutical sales reps, for example, that doctors just don't want to meet with them anymore. And trying to get time with a doctor is almost impossible. So I think we just need to recognize always as organizations the changing reality and just knowing that it's just gotten much harder and we need to provide much more support. And if we don't, that's a huge mistake.
And I also see so many companies that, oh, I want to sell more service contracts, like Rob says. But the customer doesn't want to sell more service contracts. So you want to sell them, but you're trying to talk me into some. I don't want to. So Paul, you're going to get the last word on this issue of really some of the biggest mistakes and what you would avoid, what you would say to avoid them.
Yeah, Rob referenced the myopic view a little bit earlier. And, if they make the mistake, as you pointed out, of just evaluating the relationship on sales revenue, then that's the big mistake. They're not building trust. They're not respectful. They tend to think less of the distributor as opposed to more. They're not providing the support. They're not providing the recognition, and thus they're not generating the profitability. And then they blame the distributor. So I think the myopic view, leaving out the things that really matter. You talked earlier, Bruce, about pulling the right levers. I think those are those five things: trust, respect, support, recognition, profitability.
Well, thank you guys. There's an awful lot of meat in here, and we're going to summarize all of this in a feature article as well as the show. And the insights. Listen, we're gonna add to the library of effective practices. So thank you very much, Rick Garlick, Paul Donahue, Rob Legge, and see you next time on an EEA YouTube show.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.